Welcome everybody. This is a session about CI/CD. So if you're interested in learning about the latest developments in CI/CD, as well as how to release software safely, efficiently, and improve your release velocity, you're in the right place. Thanks for taking time to see this session. It's about an hour long. We will have questions at the end on the side of the stage here. Instead of doing interactive with the headphones, it's a little challenging to do that. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Steve Rice. I'm the General Manager for AWS AppConfig. And Ranjit, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Ranjit Ramakrishnan. I'm a Product Manager in the Developer Tools team.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to start with just a look way back. You can see I have gray hair. And this is what it felt like back in the olden days developing software, sort of developing those first pipelines. But I'm going to talk about sort of my favorite moments in the history of CI/CD. I don't think you've probably been to a talk where they've talked about your favorite moments in CI/CD. But the first thing was, again, I've been doing this software for a while, was the invention of branches. How many people out there use Visual Source Safe and use labels? I'm going to say, ooh, I see a hand out there. Thank you. We'll catch up later. We started with these very primitive tools that did not support branching. You had to stick a label on the piece of software, on the piece of code, and you could develop beyond it up the trunk, but you couldn't really control simultaneous development. So the first big breakthrough was branching. The next thing I'll never forget was when all of a sudden you could automatically merge code. We used something called CVS back in the day, and you had two different branches, and it was a big mess to try to merge those two things together, and the tool itself could help you with that. That was huge. Again, you had a team, big size team. When I started my career working at a company called AOL, America Online, and we had this giant monolithic piece of software, and actually I was the build manager for it, and we tried to do a build on a Wednesday, and I'd try to start the merging on Wednesday, and it never went well. It always was a couple of days of figuring out all the merging. So automatic merging was fantastic. It didn't always work perfectly, but that was a huge breakthrough. And then the last one was some automation that happened about, wait a minute, we're going to commit our code and the build's just going to start, and then we're actually going to deploy that to production. Again, the beginnings of CI/CD. Once we had that automation, we had the little gear turning there, and it turned a bunch of other gears. That made us move so much faster. So again, sort of a look back at some of these important things that happened in CI/CD. We're going to be talking about what's happening now, and hopefully some of the breakthroughs we're doing now are just as impactful as those. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to cover a little bit from the AWS teams, how we use our tools internally. Going to cover that very quickly. And then sort of the life cycle of managing your source code. On top of that, building, the build part, deploying to production. We have some highlights there that we're going to cover. Separating the idea of a deployment from a launch with something called feature flags. You can see my shirt here. I'm going to talk about that, continuous configuration, and then monitoring, releasing, and some of the techniques and tools that you can use with AWS tools and some third-party tools. And we have a big announcement at the end of a third-party release that we're doing here. So. Okay, so this slide covers the life cycle of how we develop software inside of AWS. If you use pretty much any AWS service, you should know that internally at AWS, we use that service, and we really work hard and hammer the heck out of that service and stub our toes sometimes doing it, and all that internal usage actually ends up as features in the products that we ship to you all. So we use all the CI/CD tools we use internally. We also know that not all you are using every single tool that AWS has in the CI/CD area, and absolutely we want to embrace the ecosystem. But you can kind of pick and choose some of these things. This is the overall, and probably familiar to people that are releasing software at scale, what this looks like. So again, we have some on the left-hand side. Sorry. We have some source tools. When we do builds, we have automatic scans going on. We have tests that run. We package the thing up, again, packaging tools. And then we push to Gamma, or sometimes people call this staging. So we'll push the code automatically there. This is something really critical at AWS, and I'd recommend for you. In order to get out of Gamma, you have to get through a gate. You have to pass some tests, and you have to have alarms not ringing, not alerting. So we have stage conditions to get out of Gamma. You can see we have the integration tests. Those are being run constantly in Gamma. And then we're monitoring to make sure that the system is still stable in Gamma. And if something goes wrong, we automatically roll it back. Automatic rollback is built into a lot of tools we have, and that is such a critical thing because it allows you to move forward with a lot of confidence. You think of almost like a self-driving car, and it automatically puts you back into the lane. And so this automatic rollback is critical, and you'll see that in most of our tools. We let that bake for about an hour in staging, and then it automatically gets promoted to the next wave. You can see we have a couple different waves here. At AWS, the waves that we tend to use are waves of regions. I think we have 30 plus regions at AWS, so we'll first deploy into a smaller region and let it sit there. Bake time, it could be an hour. Depending on the change, sometimes we have a little bit longer. And then we'll bring it to 2 regions, and then 5 regions. And there's some problems that we see that don't appear until you're in a big region. Maybe you're in the Dublin region and all of a sudden something then goes wrong. Again, we roll back liberally, so we roll it back. But we have this idea of these waves that are gated. And again, I'm telling you this because you'll see this in our tools as a development philosophy. I say that at Amazon we develop code very quickly, but we release very slowly, and that's a really good philosophy that is illustrated here. So we have several waves. I think on my product we're up to 13 different waves, and it's groupings of regions for us, and making sure all along the way that there's no alarms going off, everything is proceeding as desired, and all the integration tests are passing. On the very right-hand side, you see something called feature flags. I'm not going to have you all raise your hands, but in my experience, about half of teams are using feature flags today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that as a technique. This is beyond CI/CD. You can still change the way your software behaves, and you can tweak the behavior and the resiliency and the security, all of that of your software without doing code pushes that go through all those waves. And that's something we'll cover a little bit later in the talk. But again, this is the overview of how teams at AWS are developing. This is the overall view, again, from left to right of all the stages of CI/CD, authoring and building and deploying, releasing, monitoring. AWS has a lot of different tools that are available, and again, we know that our customers are not using all of them. We want to make sure that if you're using something like Jenkins, you might plug that in, and the rest of your pipeline is going to work just fine. But you see things like code build and code deploy, Code Catalyst. On the monitoring side, there's a lot of solutions out there, and again, there are a lot of third-party solutions that our customers use. And along the bottom, you can see a lot of infrastructure as code tools that that we recommend. CloudFormation, CDK, things like Terraform are great too, and again fit into our tool chain here. So for the purposes of this talk, you see the dashed line on that timeline. We're going to zoom in on that. And we're really going to talk about the sourcing, the build and test, deploy and release part, and making sure that you're developing your software in a way that's safe for you, and you're deploying in a way that will have high quality for your teams and also allow your teams to move faster. So I am going to hand it over to Ranjith now to cover the next section.
Thank you, Steve. I hope you can hear me. Awesome. So as Steve mentioned, we're going to dive into each part of this life cycle, talk a little bit about what we have been doing and how we are trying to help customers have the same set of abilities that we showed you on how internal teams build, test, and release software. Before I begin, raise hands if you have used or familiar with tools like Code Build and CodePipeline and Code Deploy. I see a few hands go up. Okay, so this talk, first part of this, the source, the build, test, and the deploy, will be about these services that are in Code Build and CodePipeline and Code Connections and Code Deploy and all of those services. And the second part will be about AppConfig that Steve will come back and talk about. So let's start with the source lifecycle. We know that you all use lots of different third-party source providers. At AWS, we want to play nice in our tools with these source providers, and we want to make it easy for you to use source from these places. And a very common use case that customers have, at least large customers that I talk to frequently, is about hosting their source code in a self-hosted source provider, right? My own self-hosted GitHub, my own self-hosted GitLab, and and they do this on AWS and put this behind a VPC. So it is secure. You can control what connections are coming in and what connections are going out. So some of the things that we recently did is first we improved our VPC integration in how CodeBuild integrates with hosted source providers. But a recent change that we added is the ability to integrate with code connections. Anyone familiar with code connections? No. So code connections is the integration service that we have in AWS that helps other AWS services connect with third-party source providers. So for example, Code Whisperer uses code connections, and you can set up a connection with your GitHub Enterprise, your GitLab self-hosted, and once you set up a connection, then that connection is available to use in other AWS services. So that's the idea behind code connections. We want to make the management of this pretty easy. So CodeBuild had its own integration with third-party source providers. So we added support for code connections. So because of that, now you have a single service that you can manage your integration with your own with the third-party source providers. The other thing that we realize that as much as we want customers to use our tools to build, test, and deploy, we also want to play well with the ecosystem, give you the same ability, both in terms of safety, control, integration into the AWS ecosystem. So we recently, actually with the last few months, we've been adding this slowly, the ability to use CodeBuild as a runner in other CI/CD tools. Again, the intention here is that, let's say if you are using GitHub Actions for your CI/CD and you want to run builds, and instead of bringing your own self-hosted runners, you can use CodeBuild as the runner. And the advantage of that is that it is obviously integrated into the AWS ecosystem. You can use the same security principles and still take advantage of all of the great features that CodeBuild has. So we have seen several large customers, several banking customers that have really jumped on this feature and have taken CodeBuild as their runner inside of GitHub and GitLab. So this is some of the changes that we have recently introduced on how to better integrate with source. So now that we've talked about source, let's talk about building applications. In terms of building applications, there are lots of things that we can talk about, but at least in the way of what are some of the improvements that we have done recently. Our build platform, which is CodeBuild, was generally pretty good for Linux-based builds. We did support Windows. We support different compute platforms. We introduced the ability to run builds on top of Lambda as well as on EC2. So you had some choices, but we still had some gaps that we had to go fill. A big one in that is supporting Windows developers. A big gap in the support for Windows developers was integration with VPC. Our VPC integration was something that customers had a lot of feedback on, and we worked hard to improve the VPC integration, so that way you can build your application on a Windows compute and then pull code from a source provider that is behind a VPC, right? This is the scenario that we talked about in the beginning. There was some feedback that we had to go address, and we made some improvements. Recently, maybe a month and a half ago, the other thing that we introduced is the ability to run builds out of containers. So for folks who did not know, CodeBuild The way we provide a secure build environment is that we run a host. On the host, we run a container image something that you can provide yourself, or we have a standard image, and then we run all of that in that container. So you cannot quite break out of the container. It is secure, and everything runs in there. But there are some workloads that are not amenable to run directly inside of a container, especially if you're doing Docker-based builds for Windows. You can't quite do Docker on Windows. So we introduced the ability to run builds directly on the compute. So that's one. And other use cases, we have customers that are building drivers, customers that are building certain low-level applications, and that can't really use container environment to go build the application. So the support for Windows is sort of the first step in the ability to do non-containerized builds. Again, which sort of leads me to the next one, is while you made life better for Windows developers, one of our top customer asks in code build has been supporting Mac developers, supporting iOS developers. Today, there was no good solution. We support different types of compute and operating system. Customers really wanted us to do this on Mac. So a few months ago, we introduced the ability to run, have Mac OS as your compute environment. In code build, there are two types of compute that is available. One is called on-demand. So just as you trigger a build, we'll provision an instance, we'll download the image, bring an environment for you to run the build. And then we also have something called a reserved capacity. So it is a fleet of machines that are available and ready to go all the time that you manage, that is running all the time. Obviously, there is management layer that we provide. So for Mac OS, this is based on that reserved capacity. You have a fleet of Mac OS-based compute. It uses M2 instances with the Sonoma OS version, and just because it's the same code build capability under the hood, it runs directly on Mac with caching and with the caching support. Now your builds on Mac are going to run much faster. So we added this ability to support Mac. The one reason you see an asterisk in there is that you need to have a 24-hour reservation period for a Mac instance due to licensing challenges that we have. I'm happy to talk about that separately afterwards. But that's the reason I at least did not want to leave you with the impression, still tell you that this is kind of what we currently have. So talk about code, how we integrate well with third-party source providers. We talked about how we have improved building applications. Another thing we recently introduced is the ability to retry a build on failure. So you can automatically retry a build if it fails. You don't have to manually restart the build. So our goal, our theme has been how do we continually tweak performance in code build, as well as how do we remove some sharp edges in the customer experience. So now that we talked about build, let's talk about the deployment process. So here I'm going to talk a lot about CodePipeline. CodePipeline was initially released as a service to help orchestrate your release process. And we've been making some small improvements for several years. The last year or so, we've added a lot of new features. Steve talked about the pipeline that we have internally and how we can have these stages and how we can move changes through these stages and check the impact in that stage while limiting the blast radius of that impact. So in CodePipeline today, there is a pipeline. Pipeline has one or more stages. Stages run sequentially. A stage has one or more actions. Actions could be, I want to run a build and in ECR deploy and push. I want to run unit test. I want to run a code scan. So these are all actions. You put them into a stage and you sort of create a pipeline. Actions can run in sequence or in parallel. And a stage succeeds when all the actions in that stage succeeds, because we want to make sure that everything that you have outlined, laid out in that stage has completed successfully before you move to the next stage. A stage fails if any action in that stage, fails. So Steve talked about the stage conditions. So we added recently the ability to define sort of these conditions as exit and entry criteria for a stage. The idea behind this is you have different life cycle events for a stage. Before a change enters a stage, or when a change has completed the stage, meaning I've deployed everything. Steve showed the scenario where there were some stage conditions after the deployment has completed, where we are running integration tests, where we are running checking for CloudWatch alarms going into alarm state. So that's what we call an on success, and then there is an on failure, where any action in the stage fails. I want to react to that. The idea behind these stage gates is that this is a good way to enforce organizational standards. And then if for whatever reason a change fails one of these conditions, authorized users can manually override the failure. So let's say at the entry, something failed, the condition failed, the entry was blocked. Authorized users can say, all right, I understand the risk, I still want to override the entry here. So let's dive into what the stage level conditions look like. So as I'm for a pipeline, and then there is a stage. A stage has 3 lifecycle events: before entry, on stage success, and on stage failure. And you can define a condition in one of these lifecycle events. And a condition is of 2 parts. It has 1 or more rules, and I'll give you an example of what these rules are. And what is the remediation action you will take, or you want to take, when one of these rules fail. So some of the rules that we have today, CloudWatch alarm, or I can check a Lambda invoke. So for example, teams, I have customers who use third-party external change management system. They want to check if this change can be deployed based on the change management system. So you can use a Lambda invoke as a custom rule to say, I'm going to go check in ServiceNow if this change has been approved. If it has been approved, then this change can progress into that stage. So we have several rules. I'll show you a demo of how this all looks like. And then when you define these rules, you have the ability to sort of put them together as a condition. And then if any of these rules fail, you can do 1 or more of these actions. So you can say, I want to block the entry. So this is an entry-level condition. Something failed. I don't want the pipeline to move forward. Or I can roll back in an exit scenario. So a couple of good examples of what customers have been able to achieve is, before deploying into production, I want to check a deployment window. My team only allows deployment Monday to Friday between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Pacific time. I want to check that and only then allow deployment to happen. Or deployment has happened, I want to check if this thing is successful. So that's sort of how we introduce sort of the gating mechanism. And one of the common ask that we've heard from customers is, how do you do emergency deployment? So we introduced the ability to do something called skipping stages. I'm actually running out of time. I'll keep an eye on it. Skipping stages, essentially, this as part of the condition check, you can check 1 or more rules, and if you see that the rules, 1 of the rules fails, you can skip that stage. So this is a good way to have a pseudo branching pipeline. So I'm pushing a change. I want this change to get to production stage quickly as possible, so I can have some conditions check in my beta stage, in my gamma stage, and get to my wave 1 very quickly. So that's a change that we added recently. So the idea that what we're trying to achieve here is that we want you to confidently deploy your changes, and then if anything bad happens, you have the confidence that you can quickly recover from it using rollback, both an automated and a manual process. So Recently, we introduced a whole new set of other additional integrations to make it easy for you to build more robust pipelines. But I think I've gone a little bit longer than where I want to be. So what I'm going to do instead is switch over to the demo and show you some. All right. Hope you can see this. So here is an example of a pipeline that we have that Steve was talking about. There is a build stage where we run tests and we scan the code, and then there are these waves where you deploy to, there are these stages where we deploy to each of these waves. And here is an example that I have of a pipeline that I wanted to push a change to as an emergency deployment very quickly. So I did a build, I ran some tests, and then I said I want to skip both my beta and gamma stage, and I want to get to production very quickly. Obviously a bit risky, but at least you are trying to roll forward with a change, and that's what this pipeline shows. And just sort of the way of doing this. So for each one of these stages, I have a condition, and I can check that before entry. In this case, I can check some variables. In this case, I'm checking if the code quality is good for that particular stage. For gamma, I am checking if I can actually deploy coming from an external system. So I can define these conditions in my pipeline, and at runtime allow the change and the context in the change to figure out whether I should move forward or not. So now that we've talked a little bit about how do we orchestrate the change, we talked about how we deploy the change into production. Steve's going to come back and talk a little bit about what can you do to safely release software. Steve.
Great. Thanks, Ranjit. Okay. I'm going to talk to you about continuous configuration. This is a term that you may or may not have heard of. You've heard of continuous integration and deployment, but configuration is something that happens after the code is released, after it's on production. It's a technique that we use at scale inside of Amazon. We did not invent it. There are a lot of sort of feature flag services out there and a lot of great ones, but we definitely use it at scale. Typically what we use feature flags for, or operational flags sometimes we call them, is to turn on and off features. So I'll tell you, this week is a super busy week for services turning on and off features as things launch at reInvent. The secret is we actually probably pushed the code last week or the week before and hid it behind a feature flag so nobody could access it. But this week and today and tomorrow and the next days, we'll just have a lot of feature flags being flipped that make the code available and the feature available to customers. Again, we do things by tuning our operations. We have these kind of knobs and dials that allow us to adjust things, like maybe you want to limit the number of background tasks that are allowed to operate, or your timeout times, or thread pool size, those kind of things. We use operational flags all the time to be able to tune and react quickly to production. The logging thing, I'll do a demo on a technique that we use to change our logging verbosity. It's kind of a neat one. And all these are concepts to allow to limit the blast radius of a change. That's something that is just everything we do. We want to make sure that, as I said, we develop quickly, but we release slowly. So, feature flags allow you to move faster, but also allow you to react on production and reduce your MTTRs in a really powerful way. And the way you do it, your app is sitting there sort of pinging the configuration data on a regular basis. Maybe it's once every 10 seconds or something, and it's reading that. And if the configuration data changes, and the configuration data could be a feature flag, then the application changes. So you're not having to restart the app. You're not deploying new code through production. Of course, you want your CI/CD pipelines to be flowing well, and they should be flowing quickly. But again, you can react to things in 5 seconds rather than 20 minutes or something. So. So some of the benefits, early I had that picture of the tree and the branches. Branches were a huge innovation, but they can cause some problems. And what we do inside at Amazon, and a lot of our customers do, is they'll actually use trunk-based development. Instead of having these branches and try to merge them, they're going to have everything done on the trunk. And everything has a feature flag behind it. So what that means is when you deploy out that piece of code, let's say there's 10 features in there, all on the trunk, all of the features are off by default. The code is deployed, and you slowly turn on the 10 features. And if something goes wrong with one of the features, you don't have to roll everything back. You can just flip that feature flag to off for that one sort of rogue feature that's causing problems. So again, this is a super powerful technique. It's really easy to do to separate that idea of a code deployment from launch. Werner Vogels is the CTO of Amazon. He has a nice blog post out there about continuous configuration. At the risk of reading my slide, I'm going to read what he said. By using continuous configuration to react to changes in real time, you're building your capabilities so when an opportunity presents itself, you'll be able to respond. That's what it's all about, is being able to respond quickly to events. He hints at some things that we're looking at. Maybe there's some signals that are happening out there that allow you to respond before it really blows up into a real incident. So some pretty cool and powerful techniques using these tiny little feature flags. So we have a lot of customers using feature flags, external ones and internal ones. We're the feature flagging service, I should say we. AWS AppConfig is the feature flag service for S3 and Bedrock and Amazon Video, Prime Video, and Amazon.com. But customers tell us that essentially they're able to reduce that MTTR. There's a huge difference when you're reacting to a problem on production between a 5-second outage and a 1-minute outage and a 5-hour outage. If you can react really quickly, your customers may never even experience anything that's a problem if you can react really quickly. So feature flags allow you to do that. Always, probably you all have, you're testing in Gamma or testing in a QA environment, and if you have a QA team, everything passes, everything looks great. In that environment, everything's great. But maybe on production, your data texture is a little bit different, and you will see a problem that never occurred in test, but it did occur on production. By using feature flags, you can slowly release it to your users and limit that blast radius so you can, on production, you can validate that everything's working just fine. You can release that software deploy frequency. And again, we have customers telling us by moving to this trunk-based development, they were releasing things once every 2 weeks was the big push out to production, and as I even mentioned back at AOL, there's something would go wrong, and they'd have to go back and remerge things and pull out some code, and it was a lot of complication. That's why once every 2 weeks was as fast as it could get. If you're releasing the trunk, you can release much faster, and you can increase the release velocity. You can also use features. I'm not going to cover this in this talk, but you can use feature flags to sort of do that A/B test. You can have half of your users experiencing one thing and half of your users experiencing something else, and you'll know whether or not that change was good by the data that you collect. We have another customer that was they ingested podcasts. They're a big media company, and every day they would ingest millions and millions of podcasts that were published by podcasters. And you can imagine the metadata around podcasts is not very consistent if it's sort of self-published. And so they would have algorithms for ingesting and categorizing these podcast episodes. But they didn't want to make a change that would break everything. So what they did is they used AppConfig and feature flags to slowly introduce new changes to how they ingest podcasts. So this wasn't a feature release, this was an ingestion, new capability that they were doing. And every single thing they would release again to 1% of the podcast episodes they're ingesting, and then 5%, and then 10%, and made sure that there were no downstream unexpected problems with that. And if there was, an alarm would go back in and roll back automatically, and they could adjust quickly. So again, this idea of sort of an A/B test or slow release of new capabilities, not just end user features, is really powerful. I'm going to do a demo here. Let me switch over, thank you. Okay, to set up this demo, there's sort of two key components. I talked to you about that use case. By the way, I pre-recorded my demo. Ranjit did a live demo. I'm not that brave, so You'll see a play button in a second. But to set this up, actually, I think I need to set this. Let me get it going here. This is the use case of using a feature flag to change the logging verbosity the verbosity of your logging. So you might have it normally set to info probably, and then you might want to set it to debug. The reason you might want to do this is to get a lot more information, and you don't want to have to push out a code release in order to set your logging verbosity to debug. This is something you could do in a feature flag. And so in this case, there might be a security incident going on, and you have some signals to say, seems like something strange is going on. I want to set my logging so I can really see all these different things. So we're going to start here in AppConfig, and I'm going to create a feature flag. I'm going to name the feature flag logging verbosity. I think I have a typo here. Yes, logging verbosity as the name of the configuration profile. I'm going to actually go into AppConfig here and name this as the name of the flag, the specific flag to read. And there's a key that the code will read to. You'll see there's a checkbox that says this is a short-term flag. Sometimes with feature flagging, you get a lot of sort of flag clutter of stale flags. We have some tools here that you can do. You can check this and say, hey, I want to clean this up later. The code doesn't do, or AppConfig doesn't do it automatically. You have to do it, but it's a reminder. You can set a deprecation date there too. But in this case, this is a long-term flag I want to leave in there. I'm going to turn it on. And I'm going to set an attribute, which allows you to set the word info or debug. So this key, I think I called it value here. Let's see if I'm right. Yep, OK. Another typo. So I'm going to set this here to info. So again, I'm setting this part up. I'm setting up the flag. And I'm going to then the second part of this demo, okay, define the attribute. Okay, so this is the feature flag part. This is just the review. Yes, this is how I want it all set up. And you can see it is set to info. And the second part of this is I'm going to set up an alarm. And if this alarm triggers, it's going to flip this feature flag off. Oh, here I'm deploying out the feature flag. To just make it available on production so that my application can read, and it'll say, oh, it's set to info. I'm going to keep logging verbosity at info. OK, so now I'm going to jump over to CloudWatch. You can use CloudWatch. You can use other things, Datadog, New Relic, Dynatrace. And so you're going to set up an alarm that is going to look for suspicious behavior. So this alarm here is actually looking for something that is IAM names. So it's monitoring an API, and it says, I'm going to see how many times list IAM names is going to be pulled. And over the course of running your application, that should be pretty consistent. But this does some anomaly detection that says, seems like something, it's getting listed, somebody's calling list IAM names way more frequently, and that seems kind of suspicious. So that gray band this is CloudWatch. The gray band is in the normal range. Everything's sort of jumping up and down. On this alarm, I also have a couple actions configured. So yeah, it's called suspicious activity detected. Again, with CloudWatch and any other service, you can have, if the alarm sounds, what is the action you want to have happen. So here, I'm going to click on actions. I have two actions. The first is I'm going to run a Lambda. And that Lambda is actually going to call that feature flag and flip that feature flag. And I just called it that. I'm also going to send a notification to an SNS queue so that you can be alerted if this seems like something might be suspicious. All right. So everything's all sort of set up. You have your feature flag. You have your alarm there. And then I'm going to just flip over. I triggered the alarm. And you can see the red parts there. Something suspicious. I called that API too frequently. And it went ahead and noted that, and it triggered the actions. As you recall, the actions are that Lambda. And then that Lambda is what flips that feature flag to, not from info, but flipped it over to debug, as you can see here. So again, that is sort of a daisy chain of a bunch of different events that happens instantly. The idea of automating your feature flags is super powerful, but I didn't do any code deploys with this. All I did was set up a feature flag, set up an alarm to trigger the feature flag to change. And again, that allows you to react super. All right. Flip back to our presentation. Okay, quick announcement. So, I told you like having that while you're driving, the lane control or automatic crash detection, super important. AppConfig today has this idea of automatic rollback based on CloudWatch alarms, but actually I said today, we're announcing an integration with Datadog. Now you can roll back on a third-party alarm. So Datadog is our launch partner on this, but again, if you're using New Relic and Dynatrace, you can use those as well. And if you have a homegrown monitoring solution, you can, as long as there's an API to do this, you can also use this to roll back your feature flag change. So I'd recommend going to the Datadog booth. We're not in the Venetian now. In the Venetian, in the expo hall, they have one of the bigger booths, and ask them if you're a Datadog user. If you're not a Datadog user, I'd recommend looking at what else we have there for, again, some of these other third-party APM providers. And CloudWatch is natively built in as well. So this was a really exciting launch. The author of the Datadog extensions in the audience, I think, James, you want to raise your hand? James is over there. He wrote, if you want to ask him some questions. He also has some stickers when you walk out. He's here to hand out stickers. So make sure that you do that. OK, that concludes our session. We're going to stand over here and answer some questions if you have them. And go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, I looked at the clock and I think I messed up. I was thinking that's how far along I was.
Oh, yes.
So if you don't mind,
sure.
Maybe I'll go back and just show you how I had set that thing up, because I just literally ran through that. My apologies for freaking myself out in the process.
Here's your clicker.
Yeah, thank you. OK. I didn't do a good job of setting this up. I think I just ran through this very quickly, probably confused you all in the process. So I have a pipeline here, as I was mentioning, trying to build this slowly releasing thing that Steve talked about. I'm going to release a change in this case. I have two knobs that I'm going to control here. One is how quickly do I want this change to bake in each stage? Because I'm in a hurry, for example. I want to go through each one of my waves quickly because I'm trying to fix something as an emergency deployment. That is one parameter I'm controlling. Another parameter I'm controlling is this is a production-only deployment. I'm really trying to rush a fix into production. So I have this as a flag. So I'm going to say this is true. And I'm going to release this change. So while that is happening, I'll show you what the pipeline actually looks like. So I have a couple of input parameters. As I said, bake time. The bake time for each stage. I'll show you how I use that. And then prod only is basically, these are all defined variables. You have the ability to define them. And then in each stage, we also introduce some ability to deal with failures. So for example, you can say enable automatic retry on stage failure. So you have any transient errors, you can deal with that. And then when you retry, you can say either retry the entire stage or retry just the failed actions. So that's how I have set the source stage up. Let's look at the stage where I have some conditions set up. So in this case, here's what I'm checking. If this is a production-only deployment, I'm saying if that is the case, skip this stage. So I'm using a rule called the variable check. I'm checking the value of the prod-only variable, And if it is not equal to true, then this thing fails. And the result of that is it is a skipping stage. Let's look at one that is at the exit stage. Steve mentioned about a CloudWatch alarm. So in this case, I'm checking, if I'm getting a lot of traffic, and based on sort of the new change that I have deployed, and if the alarm triggers, in this case, the stage will actually roll back. I can specify a wait time. I can say my bake time here is, I can say I want this to be variables, bake time. So that way, whatever value I set when I release the pipeline change, I can use that in here. Let me leave it. So I have all of these ways. Similarly, I have configured one or more conditions for each one of these stages, and eventually it gets to wave 2. So that's how you can configure stage level conditions in a pipeline and allow change to progress through the pipeline. Let's see what happened. In this case, right now, the source is done. It has run some tests. It's currently scanning code. Let's see. It did not find any vulnerabilities. It found 0 critical vulnerabilities. I also have a threshold set up to say that if it finds any critical vulnerability, it will automatically initiate a rollback. And then that completed, you can see that we are skipping this stage, we are skipping this stage, and we are going directly into wave 1. So that's why I wanted to show you in terms of how to set this up and how to run through the pipeline. Sorry, I had to come back to go do this. I was kind of freaking myself out looking at the time here. But that's it for us. Thank you. You've been great. If you have any questions, we'll be hanging out here by the side, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.